Okay. Hi, Alfonso. Are we good, Paul?
Shalom.
Great. Shalom, shalom. Okay, so this week's portion is the portion of Kedoshim, with many of the statements and commandments in the Torah, which many people in the past have assumed are the most important laws, including Rabbi Akiva, including Hillel the Elder, I believe including Jesus. Many people today quote these laws. The one that I'm going to be going for is directly to the source: love your neighbor as yourself. It has been said by some people in the negative: don't do unto others what you would not want to be done to you. We won't be discussing the nuances of positive versus negative, but we will going into some of the nuances of the verse itself, in particularly in context of where this features in the Torah. Before I start with all the analytics and the opinions, etc., just asking a very easy question. If anyone wants to try and say an answer to this question, please feel free. So love your neighbor as yourself. It's very understandable from many aspects. Why is this such a challenging law? So this is a commandment in the Torah, to love your neighbor as yourself. Why is this so challenging? Who finds this challenging? Why is this so challenging? Does anyone want to have a go at why they or others find this a challenging law?
How do you love yourself, Rabbi?
Okay, so Alfonso is already going for one of the questions that I have. Alfonso, tell me if I'm putting words into your mouth, but you're saying, how do you love yourself? The implication is you're loving someone else like yourself. So therefore, you have to have loved yourself in the first place in order to make that a real commandment that you're loving someone else as much as yourself. How do you love yourself? That is a great question, Alfonso, and a lot of people find that challenging. A lot of people deal with, self-esteem issues and anxiety and depressions, etc. So how do you love yourself? Thank you, Alfonso. That is exactly one of the questions that I have. Anyone else want to suggest any other reason why people find it difficult to love others like themselves? Yes, Ruth. Oh, you want to say something? I'm not sure.
Okay.
I don't know. I just screen came with you, so I'm not sure if you were saying something.
Okay. Just to say, I think it's because we mistakenly think that we're separate from other people and that we're different, but actually we all so linked to each other. We're not separate entities. I mean, we are individuals, but we're not separate from each other.
Okay, so you're answering the question by saying it's not so challenging if we see big picture. If we realize that we're all either, and again, I'm putting words into your mouth, but just, if we all realize we're a communal consciousness, or we all are, in the image of God, or whatever you want to place it as, we're all part of the same human species. It's not so challenging to love others when it's just an extension of yourself. Okay, that's a good suggestion of an answer. I like it. Anyone else, just for the last thing, whoever's arrived, just asking the question before we dig into what it means to love your neighbor as yourself, just asking the question, why do people find it difficult to love other human beings? So Alfonso has suggested it's difficult to love yourself. So how are you meant to love others as much as yourself? Ruth has suggested that maybe it's not so difficult when you realize that people are the same as you, or we're all more united than we are separate. Anyone else want to, just give last opinion of why it could be challenging to love others? Anyone else want to think about that for a second? Yeah, Paul.
I think possibly because, well, I'm speaking for myself now. I find I'm basically selfish. So number one is me. if I'm taken care of, then I might think about others. And that's generally where I think my problem is.
Okay, well, Paul, when I come to your house, I'll make sure that I get the last piece of chicken before you. Okay, no, I'm just playing with you. But Paul, first of all, when you say you're selfish, we all are, of course, and I acknowledge that you are very open and honest, but everybody feels that way, and it is very difficult to share your last Rolo with someone else. Why should someone else have it and not me? Especially if it's mine, forgetting about if it's joint, if it's communal. But if it's mine, why should I give that to anybody? So that's also a challenge that we have to face. I'll tell you some of the things that I thought of, and thank you for all whoever spoke up. The first thing that I said is, why is it challenging about this law? And please don't feel, that don't take this personally, okay? But I'm saying people are sometimes annoying and they sometimes are evil. Now, I've never really met someone that I would label as an evil person. That's just me. I know other people who swear to me that they know evil people. But I know that I have seen people, thank you, okay, I'll come to you in a second, Paulette. I have seen people who have acted evil. And I've acted evil myself, I'm sure, if I thought about it hard enough. And, it's not easy to love people when people are annoying and they are acting like buffoons or they're malicious or whatever case it is. So that's my first reason of why it's difficult. Now, someone else sent a comment here saying that one reason why they find it difficult is because people are scared of getting hurt. So maybe part of, not loving others, not opening your love to others is because you're scared that someone won't love you back, or they might do some other type of reaction. And Paulette, I think that's something that I'm going to add to my list because I didn't think of that. That's a great suggestion as well. The other ones that I had were, all of us are moody. We have moods. So it's difficult to love when you're in a bad mood. You arrive at work, you're in a bad mood, someone cut you off at traffic, whatever the situation is, and it's very difficult to love in that situation when you're in a bad mood. So that's going to be another challenge. A third one. Can you hear me?
May I ask?
Still good with the audio?
Is this similar in your thinking to do unto others as you would have them do unto you? Because that's...
So Jen, I'm going to address that in a few seconds. Okay, we're going to go into what does this verse actually mean when it says love your neighbor as yourself. Is it akin to actions or is it feelings? Good question. I'm going there in a second. That's exactly where I'm going with this. So just to give a summary and almost an introduction of why, before we even analyze the Torah text, why do people find it difficult to love? So we've suggested it's hard to love oneself. We suggested people don't love because they're scared of getting hurt. I said it's hard because sometimes people are in bad moods and they just don't feel like loving. Sometimes they are in the mood of loving, but the people that they're around aren't deserving of love. They're acting like, they're not acting appropriately, and you don't want to love those people. Also, this is one of those laws. You always are surrounded by people in life. It's very seldom that you're just on your own. I mean, again, COVID aside, because everyone's got used to being alone during COVID, but in a normal world, you're most of the time around people. So it's a constant obligation to think of others and be considerate of others and love others. How can you do something so consistently all the time? That's another challenge that I had. And the last one is, it's hard to know what others want from you. So you could have the best intentions in the world, but if you don't really know what other people like, maybe it's going to be very challenging to love them because you think that you're doing something nice to them, but you're actually hurting them. Or vice versa, you don't know what's nice to them, so you do nothing, but they get upset because you did nothing. So those are some of the challenges that we face when it comes to thinking of others and being loving to them. And that's why, when Rabbi Kiva said this is the golden rule, love your neighbor as yourself, and the rest of the Torah's commentary, I think that was Hillel, but Rabbi Kiva quoted this, and as I said, it went on to many, many religions. If you had to go ask the average person in the street, what's the major law in the Torah, they may well say this law. It's not an easy thing to do. Okay, now, bar that aside, we'll try to deal next week with what are some of the things that we can do to try and develop love for others. Today, we're going to be more conceptual of what is demanded from us in this law. Okay, let's start off with the words. Love your neighbor as yourself. Va'ahavta l'reacha kamocha. It is in chapter 19, verse 18 of Leviticus. It's this week's Torah portion. In Hebrew, va'ahavta, and you shall love, it's in single, which is interesting. It's not delivered to the children of Israel. It's if, whoever is speaking, Moses, is talking to you or to me and saying, and you shall love to your neighbor, l'reacha, the le in Hebrew, it means to. And you shall love to your neighbor, kamocha, like yourself. The first thing I want to address is that to. Because in English, love your neighbor as yourself makes perfect sense. But in Hebrew, when you say love to your neighbor as yourself, is there anything in that to? Well, most commentaries suggest that there's nothing in it. And it's just the way that Hebrew speaks of just saying a la. You could have just said the verse love, v'ahavta re'acha kamocha, and it would have meant exactly the same. It's just more grammatically correct to have that la, that lamed sound. That's the majority of views, but there are others, including the Ramban, Ibn Ezra, and Sephorno, who say no, it is for a very specific reason. I looked it up in English. I mean, I'm not like an English person in the sense of I don't know all the rules and the grammar. They call it like dative tense, a dative tense of a word, D-A-T-I-V-E. It doesn't exist a lot in English, but it does exist in other languages. It's kind of like the best way of example of what a dative text is like. Instead of saying I think, it's like me thinks that this is good. It still makes sense. In some languages you can talk like that. In English it doesn't sound so good. But listen to the way that these commentaries change the meaning. And the reason why they're changing the meaning is not just because the le sounds a little bit funny, love to your neighbor like yourself, but they have more conceptual problems. Like the Ramban has a problem, and this is your problem, Alfonso. I mean, not your problem, but the problem that you brought up, which is how can you love someone as much as yourself? It's an impossible task. The Ramban is assuming that you only can know yourself, really. You can never know someone else as much as yourself. And if knowledge is tied to love, meaning you can only really love something that you really know, therefore it's impossible to love someone as much as yourself. And therefore, if you interpret it in terms of an emotion, that you should get a feeling inside of love for someone else, even if it's your spouse, even if it's your child, as much as yourself, it's an impossible task. Now, some people would argue and say that, no, we argue with you, Ramban, because we love people more than ourselves. And I think a lot of depressants will say similar things by saying, we don't love ourselves, but we do love our children. Or we don't love ourselves, but we do love our parents. Or we do love our girlfriend, but we find it hard to love ourselves. But the Ramban is assuming that love is attached to knowledge. And therefore, if you can know yourself better than any other human being, therefore you can love yourself more than any other human being, and it's impossible that you can love someone else. The Malbim and others, I mean, others before the Malbim said this as well. Ibn Ezra asked this in the Ten Commandments. is how can God command us to have an emotion? So I can understand God saying to us, don't eat pork, because that's something within our grasp. I mean, we know what a pig is. We know what the smell of bacon and the look of bacon looks like. And when you go into the restaurant, you say no. Okay, that's easy. But what about laws like loving others as much as yourself? You either love the people or you don't love the people. It's an emotion deep down in your heart or deep down in your soul, wherever emotions are kept. So how can God command us in emotions when we're not even in control of our emotions? So because of these two questions, how can God command us in something that's impossible? And not only that, but how can God command us in something which is an emotion? Because of these questions, these commentaries, the Ramban, Ibn Ezra, and Sforno, change the meaning of the verse. And they say it doesn't mean have a feeling of love towards others like you love yourself. Okay? Rather, it means, I'll come to your question in a second, Paulette. Rather, it means wish the best for others. Have the best intentions for others. It doesn't mean that you're going to have a feeling deep down in you that you're going to love them as much as you love yourself, but it means wish for others what you would want to wish for yourself. Now, Jen, you were asking, does it mean do to others? They're even one step behind that. And they're saying it doesn't even mean do, it means wish for others. I'll just quote you some of the exact words that they say. The Sforno says, love for your neighbor what you would love for yourself. The Ibn Ezra says, one shall love good for one's neighbor as one loves it for oneself. The Ramban says, it means love what is good for your neighbor without limitations, just as one loves what is good for oneself. All of those commentaries are getting away from the idea that you need to have a feeling of love inside for others. They're rather saying it's a more intellectual consideration of wishing the best for others as much as you would wish for yourself. So if you get a fancy car, you don't think to yourself, well, I've got it, and therefore no one else should have it. Rather, you should wish the same for everybody else as what you would wish for yourself. Okay, so that's their opinion. Now, Paulette asked the question, do you not want someone to treat you as you would treat them, and for you to be treated as you would treat them? Okay, so that's much more along the lines of what Jen was saying, that there is some type of action involved. Hold that for a second. Okay, good question, both of you. Hold that for a second. So our first reading into the verse, when it says love to your neighbor as yourself, the two doesn't just mean grammatically, like most commentaries say, but it could mean love for others as much as for yourself. Wish for the best for others as you would want to wish for yourself. And that changes the whole meaning of what loving your neighbor is. It's just having a consideration for them in your mind that you want the best for them, but it doesn't mean that you have to have deep love in your heart for them. Okay, that is the first group of opinions. Let's come to the next opinion. Kamocha, love your neighbor as yourself. Now we're focusing on the kamocha as yourself. Three opinions. Again, I'm not quoting everyone who said each opinion. There's so many, but I'll just quote you the ideas that I found behind each one. The first one is the regular read. The regular read is read kamocha as an adverb. So when it says love your neighbor, how should you love your neighbor? As yourself. I think that that's what a definition of an adverb is. An adverb defines the verb, or it qualifies how the verb is done. So love your neighbor, how should you do it? As much as yourself. That's the regular read. And again, you'll still have those problems, Alfonso, of how can you love others as much as yourself? But that's the regular read. There's two other ways to read this, and we're two nuances, but I'm just going to give the major two. love your neighbor, not adverb how you should love, but rather an adjective, a qualification of who the neighbor is. So it's saying, love your neighbor. Who is your neighbor? Your neighbor is like you. Again, the first one was an adverb where like yourself was defining the love. Now, the second opinion is love your neighbor as yourself. As yourself is defining the neighbor, not the love. So what does that mean? That you are loving your neighbor like the neighbor is like you. What does that mean? So this is a whole literature on its own. But the major three that I came up with within all the different opinions is some people assume it means indeed. Okay, so what that means is people who are good like yourself, they have the same deeds as you. Those are the people that you should love. But it doesn't mean that you should love your enemies. And it doesn't mean that you should love people you don't like. And it doesn't mean that you should love immoral people. It means people who act the same way as you, treat them in a similar way. Okay, so that's very similar to what Jen was saying and Paulette. It means treat others who are like you in the same way that you would treat yourself. So that is a very different interpretation of, loving everyone, because it's pigeonholing who you should love, people who are indeed the same as you. Another way of looking at it is, it's a much broader, this could say, it means everybody, love everybody. Why? Because everybody is like you, like your neighbor is like you. Why? Because you're both created in the image of God. So that's the same interpretation of saying the word like yourself is defining the neighbor, except here, instead of saying the neighbor who's like you indeed, or you in social economic class, or you in race, or you in whatever little pigeonhole you want to give from the first opinion, this one's saying it means love everybody, but because your neighbor is the same as you, you're both created in the image of God. So that's the complete opposite of the first opinion. It's saying that you should love your neighbor who is like you because they created in God's image. And then the third opinion, and this one I don't like, okay, but this one has been espoused by some commentaries. They say that love your neighbor like yourself, your neighbor who is like you, not just in deed, but in their views. They have to have similar views to you in order for you to love them. That was some medieval commentaries that thought that you only need to love people with the same views. It's very counterintuitive to what modern society says, that you should love people with different views and be open and accepting. But just throwing that out there was that opinion. So that is a whole different version of loving your neighbor. Either it's expansive to everyone because we're all in the image of God, or it's pigeonholing them to say you should only love the people who are similar to you. Okay, and the last one, what does it mean like yourself? Love your neighbor as yourself. It's a consequence. So what this opinion says is love your neighbor so that he will love you like you love yourself. It's almost saying you should love your neighbor so that he loves you, and that when he loves you, it will be like you love yourself. It will be as if, you throw, I don't know how to say it, but like on an energetic level, throw the energy out there to your friend and he'll respond back with the same energy back to you. It's a consequence. It's not saying that you should love him as much as yourself, but it's saying if you throw the love out there, the love that will come back to you, you'll feel, because you'll know what that love is for yourself and you'll feel the love coming from him. Okay, so it's more like a consequence. Okay, so what have we done so far? So far, we've focused on the love to your neighbor like yourself. And we mentioned it might mean not so much a deep love, it might just be talking about wishing the best for others. We've had the kamocha, which means as yourself. it either is just a regular adverb describing that you should love them as much as yourself, or the other opinion saying it's defining who the neighbor is. And depending on which commentary you go by, the neighbor is either very much like you in view and deed, or not at all like you, but just like you because he's created in the image of God. Okay, let's go to the end of the verse and then the beginning of the verse, and then we finished. The end of the verse says, okay, is that hand a question? I'm not sure, Jen. If it is, please ask. Is it a question?
I can wait.
Okay, no, go for it. I can also wait, so go for it.
Okay, well, because I tried to do a workshop right on this thought. We tried to examine it in a different way. So on your second interpretation, which has to do with the doings, do unto others, what we arrived at after hours and hours of exploration was, might it be more realistic to say, assuming that you care about people, do unto others as they would have you do unto them?
Do unto others as they would have you do unto them, meaning, tell me if I'm correct here in my understanding of you, but kind of like, do what you think people would want you to do to them.
Well, I can give a trivial example, okay?
Yes.
Somebody's 80th birthday coming up. She said to me yesterday from New York, oh, of course, my husband says you must have a big party and we'll have a wonderful, we'll gather our friends and we'll gather and we'll this and that. And she said to me, a lifelong friend, of course, you know I would hate that. She is a very private person and really would much prefer to share her 80th birthday in a different way. But his need to express his love of her is going to overwhelm the doing of what do unto others as they would have you do unto them is slight sophistication on just throwing out your love indiscriminately. You know, people are the same, Ruth, yes, bless you, but they also are different and have they live a little bit in their own world. So if you can't take the time and effort to find out somewhere along the line what to do unto them, you run the risk of being not just flaky, but really wrong.
Okay, so Jen, I love your comment, and I'm going to put that comment in the word reyecha, which means friend. Love your neighbor. Who is your neighbor? Your neighbor is someone who is your friend, meaning that you've spent time with them. You've made enough effort to know that they're your neighbor, to know what they want. Otherwise, I would have said, love people as yourself. But by the fact that it mentions the word friend or neighbor, it's some type of an endearing word in the Torah. It's hard to exactly translate it. Some people translate it as friend, other people translate it as neighbor. But regardless, that closeness that it's evoking in the sentence is telling you that you have to have gone to the efforts of knowing what the person wants in order for you to actually develop that love. And I love that idea. And that's kind of what I was saying in the beginning. It's not very difficult to know what people appreciate. Yes. So thank you. That's a great comment. Okay, now just to go on the end of the verse and the beginning of the verse, which most people just look at it as love your neighbor as yourself. But there is actually an initial phrase and there is a suffix phrase. So the end phrase says, love your neighbor as yourself because I am God. Okay. Ki ani, v'ahavta l'reacha kamocha, ani Adonai. I am God. And why does it say that at the end of the sentence? So once again, there's a couple of different opinions about this. The major opinions say it's just a repeat. It's just saying, love your neighbor as yourself, thus saith the Lord. It's just like saying, as God said. Okay, that's what most commentaries say. Ibn Ezra has an interesting comment. He says, it says this because only God can give you the law to love your neighbor. Because if it's going to be like a man-made law that you should always love people, you're going to ultimately fall back into one of my questions, which is people are annoying, and why should you have to love people who are annoying? But by the fact that it's telling you an authority, that this is not just it's a nice way to live, this is happening here because God commanded it. It's telling you God has the authority to do this, and if you don't do it, you're breaking what Hashem told you to do. So it's saying this is an important event, people. You have to listen to this. That's the Ibn Ezra. Rashi says, I am God, tells you, similar to the Ibn Ezra, he says, he gives a nuance, and he says, it's not just that God has the authority, but whenever it says in the Torah, something, 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 I am God, Rashi assumes it means I am the God who rewards and punishes. So Rashi is saying that by the fact that it says that I love your neighbor as yourself, I am the Lord, it means that you get big reward for loving your friends by the fact that that phrase is added over there. And, you know, some people would say it's the most important line in the Torah based on that. The Abarbanel says, we should imitate God. So just like the beginning of this week's portion says, Kadoshim to you, ki ani kadosh. You should be holy because I am holy. And that verse also ends, I am holy. So he assumes that this whole portion is under the rubric of that first line in the parsha, be holy. So he's saying, be holy, because remember, I am God. I am that God who's holy. So therefore, when you love your neighbor as yourself, you're walking in my ways, and my ways are holy. So you will end up being holy if you love your neighbor as yourself, because I am holy, and I am the one at the beginning of the portion said, be holy. So by loving a neighbor, you end up being holy. That is the Barbanel. And the last one, and this is the most different of the readings, is it's actually a warning. It's not a blessing, like Rashi said, that you'll be blessed for doing this. It's a warning saying, you must love others, but I am God. So you should love others, but you should know that I am God, and the love that you have for me should be different than the love that you have for humans. And therefore, if there's ever, love God or love humans, always go with the love God side over the love human side, because it's a warning. That's the last opinion. Jen, did you want to say something else?
No, I'm just very curious what you think of that. That's very provocative.
Yeah, I mean, well, I think the way that I relate to that is, it's hard for me to describe a feeling of love. Like when I think of the love that I have to my creator versus the love that I have to my children, I don't like to think of it on a scale, because it's hard for me to equate those two. I kind of see the miracle of God in my children, and so it's not to me like one or the other, but that opinion seems to say that there are times where there's a clash. I mean, one clash is, for example, let's say your parents tell you to do something that you think is morally incorrect. So on the one hand, you should respect your parents and love them. On the other hand, God has told you to be moral. So sometimes there is a little bit of a clash between morals where, your intuition with God is a little bit different to the way that you feel towards others. And maybe that's what that opinion's saying. In those very particular situations where it's one or the other, you should always side with God. But, I think it's very difficult to be in that situation in the first place. And, most times in life, I think your morality will kind of be in tune with loving other people as opposed to it being a clash. So that's my feeling, but I'm just suggesting that's what one opinion thought. It's a warning. Okay. Lastly, yeah, sure. Lastly, okay, so we don't have too much time for the last thing. Maybe I'll do that next week, but I just want to conclude. Okay, so we started off by saying what makes it difficult to love others. And it could be the Ramban's argument, which is philosophical. How can you love others as much as yourself? Because you can never know someone else as much as yourself. It could be, how can you ever be forced to do an emotion? It could be things like what I was suggesting is, it's such a constant commandment. How can you always be at your A game all the time around people when people are annoying and they arrive late and they make a mess and they don't say thank you and, they talk badly about others in front of you and, all the bad things that we all do. How do you still love people in those type of situations? That's a very, very good question. We did suggest, and we'll open this up next time, things like, if you don't see what Ruth was saying, seeing the global view of humanity, that we're all Tselem Elokim, we're all created in the image of God, we all are equal. There's a beauty in diversity, there's a beauty in appreciating that people are different. We'll try to develop those things a little bit more. I'll just end off with like a concluding meditation, a concluding thing to think about when I think about how I can make myself better in terms of loving others. And this is what I'm suggesting. Number one is, I sent a video today, whoever's on my WhatsApp chat, of a prayer that is in the Siddur. Mostly Hasidim say it. It's not the Ashkenazi custom to say this. But the Hasidim always have a meditation before they do commandments. So what about the commandment of loving neighbors as yourself, which is a continual commandment the whole day? In the Siddur, in the beginning of the Siddur, it says, I take upon myself to remember to love other people like myself for the day. It's a morning meditation that they take on. I like the idea. I don't say that prayer myself, but I do think it's a nice idea to just spend a minute in the morning about thinking about, I'm going to be exposed to people today, all types of people, some on the phone, some at the shops, some people with my family, some people at work. My intention is to wish the best for them. Okay, so that's the setting the intention in the beginning. Then during the day, when you're actually with people, so this is not prior to the act, when you're actually with people, just be aware, when you're saying things, is that the best intention that you could have for the person in front of you? Are you really wishing the best for others? Forgetting about getting to that deep love and emotion that might be possible, might not. But, do you just think about the others? And as you were saying, Jen, like, have you actually thought about them? Not just about you wanting to be good, but have you thought about them in the process of trying to be good? And then lastly, at the end of the day, think about, take 1 or 2 hours that you've had, 1 or 2 events, and just think about during those times when you were with people, is there any way that you could have been more considerate? You don't have to beat yourself up because tomorrow's another chance. So that's a threefold, way that I think is helpful to people to try and be more considerate to others. Have the intention in the morning before you see people, when you're with people, are you your best self? And at the end of the day, try to pick 1 or 2 moments that you think maybe could have been improved so that you remember it for the next day. Okay, so next week we'll try to develop